Hello and welcome to BloombergQuint. We're all coming to you from the safety of our homes, trying to understand what a 21-day lockdown will mean for the economy and how the government should respond to it. We will talk over the next half an hour about various aspects of what is likely to play out in the next 21 days. Joining us for a conversation, Dr. Rathin Roy. He's joining us from his home in Delhi. Dr. Roy, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. I am going to start with a very basic, seemingly unintelligent question, but how does an economy start to respond when the nation goes into a 21-day lockdown?
No question you ask, Kira, is ever unintelligent. And that's absolutely the right question to be asking. So I'm going to move from what I've been saying earlier about the macro to the 21-day lockdown. So the best way to understand this is to ask the question, why are we in lockdown? We are in lockdown because science is telling us that social distancing and restriction of movement is the best route for India to take given the current situation, India's specific circumstances, including its availability of healthcare infrastructure, etc. That being the case, therefore, what are the economic implications of social distancing? This question can be answered at three levels, and in this segment, I'll deal with the first two, which are of immediate human interest. The first is, how do you maintain supply chains for essential commodities? That's an economic question because in business as usual, supply chains are maintained within a credit demand revenue cycle. I grow potatoes, I store potatoes, I know I'm going to sell so many potatoes with a margin of error of 10%. I sell them, I get revenue, yeah? And I use that revenue to pay for the storage of my potatoes and pay for the people who grew potatoes. If this cash flow needs mediation in terms of credit, I borrow money from the banks to make it go. But when the supply chain is broken, then I have no means of getting stuff that is stored into the city to sell. If the certainty of the periodicity by which people buy potatoes is disrupted by the lockdown, then I have to make volume adjustments, and these may not be possible because the transport infrastructure may not be there because the personnel who operate it are locked down. Right? So fundamentally, at a human level, the issue is not even one of money. The primary issue here in every state and every district of India is to make sure that the supply chain for essential commodities is functional, consistent with the requirements of social restriction. That's the first analytical question that we as a society, as an economy, have to answer. The second level has to do with livelihoods. People normally are able to pay for both essential and non-essential commodities by offering their services as factors of production or as possessors of savings to earn interest income or wage income. Let me focus on the wage income people. Since India is an informal economy, a large proportion of the people who deliver wage income, who get wage income, get it by offering labor on a low periodicity basis and getting paid within that low periodicity, which means that working capital, I'm using a business word for a household or every worker, working capital cushions are very low. A lockdown exacerbates this because there are issues with both availability and price and access. It becomes expensive for me to find potatoes to buy, thereby raising my costs and putting further load on already fragile working capital. If social distancing means that the market that I could go to by cycle is now shut, or the market, this is even without any money, this is just using my working capital. So again, here the point I'm trying to make at the second level is that the livelihood question, the question is not whether people don't have money or not. The question is, even if I get money into their hands, the fact their ability to actually engage in consumption is now far more expensive. And it is more expensive the poorer you are because the lower your working capital buffers for consumption. And therefore, I have to find ways of lowering this expense, and that's my second economic challenge. The third is the macro level. I'm not going there yet because I'm sure you want to pursue this line of thought.
Absolutely. Let me come to the first one first, which is the supply chain issues. Now, the government has said that essential commodities will be available, but on a very small sample size. We were speaking to the management at Dabur yesterday, and I asked them the same question because they will continue to produce some essential commodities. The question is, do you have packaging? Do you have trucking to move that? So, maintaining a supply chain when you have a countrywide lockdown will almost need an effort on a war footing and some great planning.
Not will, is requiring interventions on a war footing. Issuing orders on a note sheet that essential supply shops will stay open is necessary, but by no means sufficient. Also, when the principal response to a lockdown at the moment is coercive authority, maybe that's inevitable, seeing what happened on Sunday, where even people in the civil service who should know better were not even observing the rudiments of social distancing. Governors of states were not. I can quite understand the concern on part of the authorities to make sure that people understand what social distancing entails and to use coercive power to enforce it. But that coercive power makes a disincentive, which is even if I give you assurances that things will work in a supply chain, I may be disincentivized by the visible use of coercive power. So here we need, and in this sense, you're much better off in Bombay because you have a civil administration and you have a police administration, and what is required is for them to work in concert. But in Delhi, for example, there is no civil administration. It is subordinate to the Lieutenant Governor reporting to the Home Ministry, to whom reports the police. So the only actions we're getting here, police actions, there has been no communication to the general public whatsoever on the simple thing, how do I go out and get my food? In contrast with, let's say, Hyderabad, or I'm understanding today Bombay, Ahmedabad, where very clear instructions have been issued by the civil authority. So those clear instructions regarding the micro logistics is the first step. People must know, this is how I look at it. If I have to go out and get food every second or third day, how do I do it? Second thing people must know is if I have a health emergency or some other kind of emergency, what are the protocols I operate consistent with social distancing to move, to do any kind of movement that is necessary to deal with it. So if I have a heart attack, it's obvious, I need an ambulance, I need to get to a hospital, right? But if I have a situation where I require medication, then I need to know how I get to a pharmacy. If I have a situation where I have a shortage of, let's say, infant produce of a certain kind that is necessary to alleviate a problem such as, let's say, infant anemia. So this is that we thought through at a very granular level, and the level at which we think this through is the community level, where basically civil administration should focus on the unorganized communities and let rich communities like the ones you and I live in devolve to them the responsibility for answering these questions because they have private logistics. As far as movements of goods and services from farm to table and or farm to shop or factory to shop is concerned, we must understand what the problem is. The problem is not lack of logistics. There are the trucks, they were operating last week, right? There are the people, they were working last week. But in a situation where you have enforced social distancing, how do you ensure protocols where you can use these trucks, fuel them, load them, and move them? That's a classic military problem, and therefore it's not rocket science. What you need to have in every area is a task force that answers exactly the three questions I said. You need to get people into a location to produce output. I have one more thing to say and then I'll finish. You need to transport that output to where it is to be consumed, right? And you have to take a decision at that point of consumption, whether that consumption is going to happen through market or through rationing. Only three steps involved. Once those decisions are taken, you implement the protocol. But there is one caveat here, which is very important, which is that you have to decide selectively who you're going to disproportionately serve. Which means, I think, as a society, and this is not government, we have to have people understanding that high logistics individuals like you and me should be left more to their own devices than low logistics individuals. So what we need are clear instructions of where we can go using our transport to buy what. That will not suffice for the vast majority of Bombay or Delhi's population. They will also have to be enabled to go and buy things, either through giving them money or through giving them supply. So that's the contours of the supply chain problem and the consumption problem as I see it.
Okay, so just so for example, this morning there was a lot of question about how the APMC systems, etc., would function in different states. So it would be state level machinery, like you said, mapping it out as to who are the producers, how do the producers get it to a central location if required, and then how it then gets distributed and prioritized. So even at a food economy level, you don't think that it's an insurmountable problem.
It cannot, in a war, you cannot afford to use the word insurmountable. You can say the problem is surmountable, but it involves sacrifices. You can say you'll have to do with less, but there is no option to say insurmountable because then you have lost the war. Therefore, let me give you some good news in this. There is considerable idle supply chain capacity obviously sitting within the economy. So therefore, if the supply chain is constrained and if there's idle capacity, then the task is how to use it. And here, I'm afraid IAS officers and political parties have to understand that they're not supply chain experts. The supply chain experts are sitting within the private sector, within the logistics community, they're not being mobilized. So there are two options. Either the state is too weak to mobilize them, the Hindustan Lever supply chains, the Coca-Cola supply chains, they can be repurposed very easily. If the state is weak, if the state is not weak, the state needs to get on with it and do it. And it should have done it by now, but okay, do it in the next 24 hours. Talk to Hindustan Lever in every state, talk to Coca-Cola in every state. They're everywhere. They're everywhere from Mizoram to Kashmir to Tamil Nadu. You have huge redundant supply chain capacity there. Mobilize it. I'm not even talking about the army. This is just private sector capacity. If that cannot happen, then I would say the private sector needs to step in and come up with a proposal on how to use the IT supply chain capacity to be able to solve this problem of delivering essentials in a situation with restricted mobility. Again, I repeat, that's the core problem, focus on it. Delivering essentials in a situation of restricted mobility due to social distancing, right? But what you do not lack here is supply, because supply is being vastly underutilized. So we have to be very clear where the problem is. The problem is in deployment of supply, not in supply itself. And I'm talking logistics and supply chain. So we need to use that. And that can happen. The private sector can do it. They can take the initiative. I've seen countries where they've done it. They need to get together and make a proposal to government that is consistent with social distancing. So I tell Mr. Mahindra and Mr. Hindustan Lever chairperson, whose name I don't know, and other such worthies, Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, just go and do it.
Okay. Okay. I have some understanding of that part of it. Now let me move into the income side, the second point that you mentioned. So I think it has been reiterated rightly so that the daily wage earners is where you need to focus your immediate attention. I think there was at a state level, some states have announced transfers, direct benefit transfers. The government yesterday said that they have a kitty about 52,000 crore, which is lying in the state construction welfare funds, which should be dispersed to the construction workers. Those are first steps. More will be needed.
Well, first think through those first steps. So who pays the construction workers? Let me give you a concrete example. There are 60 people who would have starved to death outside my office if I had not intervened 2 days ago. The Delhi administration could do nothing. Luckily, I got a community organization, a very good community organization here, to arrange the logistics of feeding them. These people are paid by a contractor. They work for the PWD of Delhi, but they're paid by a contractor. And they're paid in bank accounts in Munika, which is about 2 kilometers from their work site, which they will need to access, even if the contractor pays them, but the contractor pays them in arrears. What you need to do here, and this is something I have also proposed to the Finance Ministry as an autonomous organization, is transfer that into direct payment to their bank accounts. The logistic task becomes getting the contractors, phoning them, contacting them, and finding out what the bank account numbers of these workers are, and making direct transfers to these. Issuing an order on a little green sheet is not going to do it. Autonomous organizations, such as my very small one, have also been told not to sack our contract labor. Yeah. I'm happy not to do that, but the law does not allow me to pay them directly. I have to pay the contractor, and the contractor is supposed to pay them. I cannot control that. And on going on past record, the contractor will not pay them because the contractor is also, resource constrained. So therefore, I need orders that supersede GFR that will allow me to directly pay them. And I also need the government to allow me to, get from the contractor within 24 hours a list of all their bank accounts so I can pay them. You see, already in this small example, there are two dimensions here. The public financial management problem, how do I get the cash into their bank accounts because it's not direct? Second is how do they access their bank accounts to get cash? There is a legitimate fear following demon in this country that banks are not always able to be cash ready. So now we have just covered the banked. What do we do about the unbanked? Clearly there it has to be a foot soldier approach. And we need to mobilize large numbers of government employees and idle private employees with protocols consistent with social distancing that allow them to actually go and disburse cash and get these people who are destitute to places where they can spend it. Consistent with the assumption that the supply chain problem we discussed in the first part has been solved. They have to be simultaneously done. That's wartime.
Okay, so given the logistics involved, so for instance, the example you gave was was very clarifying that if you have to pay a construction worker, you have to go via a contractor, etc. Can the government go directly to people via these Jan Dhan accounts? I mean, at least on paper, a large number of accounts were opened, and last I checked, I think the percentage of dormant accounts was relatively low at about 19-20% odd. Can that network at least be used to reach the bank? Of course, that would mean that the government has to make that payment, and then I'll come down to the fact as to where the government raises resources from.
No, the government has to know whose account to put what money in. No, if you're taking decisions at this level, see, the only way you supersede that problem is by saying everyone with a bank account gets some money.
Yeah,
okay, everyone with a general account gets some money. But if you're saying I want to pay construction workers, then the government will have to first find out what bank accounts these construction workers hold and where they are. That information is not with government, it's only with the contractors.
I'm saying let's not target it. Let's say that Jan Dhan accounts, and then you just do a quick data analytics on what is the average level of cash flow on these accounts, and say that X number of accounts are going to get 1,000 or 2,000 rupees.
You can do that. We have no idea whether it's going to solve your problem because you simply don't know whether the people who are. You can do that. It doesn't do any harm. And as we'll come to in a minute, I don't think we need to worry about sort of opportunity cost or trade-off of resource deployment. But that may not solve your problem because you don't know whether these Jan Dhan accounts are operational and people are even aware they're operational. You don't know whether these people are close to where their Jan Dhan accounts are or not close. Because you're talking about people who, if a typical person here walks into Canara Bank next door and says, I have a Jan Dhan account in, let's say, Jhansi, right? I don't know whether Canara Bank is going to cooperate, given limited resources at their disposal and also the general culture of non-cooperating with poor people in this country, with low fraternity, in helping this person, access that account. So then now here the banking system has to do a lot of thinking about how to solve this problem, because in business as usual, this is not a question that would be asked of the Canara Bank. So you have to do all that homework to make sure that the money that reaches that account doesn't sit idle. That's our ultimate objective. And the person who needs it has access to it and can spend it. But that's not going to happen by just transferring the money. You'll have to go down a few more kilometers into the supply chain of the money reaching this person.
True. So this is just an off-the-cuff thought. We have a fairly extensive sort of microfinance network now across at least a large part of the country. One thought would be, if the government is to transfer some cash, is to sort of deploy that network in some way.
You need to deploy all networks. But what the generals normally do is understand, have a clear map of all networks and where they reach and who they reach to the maximum extent possible. There will be some fog of war. That's okay. The type 1 error here should be, it doesn't matter if we pay twice or pay 3 times, but everyone must get some money. So we can mobilize the microfinance account, we can mobilize the Jan Dhan account, we can mobilize other accounts, but we will need to worry about the unbanked at the end of all this. Otherwise, this would be grossly inequitable. And then we'll have to come up with a resource deployment strategy. In the old days, when we had a post office network, it would be a no-brainer because we'd have the postal system. Remember, money orders, post offices. Yeah. But what is left of that can also be used. We can use financial supply chains that are in existence and create sort of point of receipt for the unbanked by using again distributed financial supply chains that Hindustan Lever, Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, and the Indian Army for that matter have. and an extensive network of treasuries, sub-treasuries, and panchayats.
Yeah.
So it's solvable, even for the unbanked. But we need some general in the Ministry of Finance as to get out of business usual mode. If necessary, call in help and expertise. There's plenty of that available. And come up with this architecture across the country. Speak to the states and to even you don't have to speak to states, speak to the circles of the State Bank of India and see if customization is necessary and start implementing. There is no harm in implementing a partial architecture which can be scaled up. The very fact that people are convinced that the architecture has been implemented and will reach them in the foreseeable future, Indians are very patient, will have a calming effect and a beneficial one.
Dr. Roy, let me move to now businesses, and I don't mean large corporations, I mean smaller businesses for starters. I think the first concern is that there will be a significantly higher need for working capital because cash flows have stopped. But not everybody will be in a position to say negotiate an agreement with someone they have rented a land or a facility from and say that, okay, I'm not going to pay the rent this time around, I'm going to pay it in 2 months, etc. How do small businesses tide over this period where cash flows are completely disrupted?
I don't know, in the sense that I know that the solution to this is for a temporary period, at least as long as the lockdown plus 15 days, government should be willing to pay the working capital costs of all unorganized suppliers. The costs of the working capital.
Interest cost on.
Yeah, well, there are two ways you have working capital. You get working capital as a consequence of a revenue cycle, or you get working capital as a consequence of borrowing, or a combination of the two.
Yeah.
Now, the reason I don't know is I don't know what to do in the former case. It's easy for me if there's a formal relationship with the bank to basically sort of pay the interest cost on working capital, which the government should. The lazy option, which I think government will take, is let the banks waive it and then we'll recapitalize them later. Obviously, the more efficient option would be for the government to pay directly. Take a monthly statement from the banks of working capital loans and give the banks the money to pay. But I know they won't do it. It's too much work. So but that doesn't solve my problem with the guy who's going to informal credit markets, right? It doesn't solve the problem with the revenue stream. The revenue stream has collapsed. Then I will have to start thinking of making block payments to unorganized sector entities and have to work out an architecture where they can come and receive these block payments. To the extent that I have a GST relationship with them, I can use the GST in reverse flow to do it. I know it's inefficient, but it's there. If I don't have a GST relationship with them, then I'll have to have, again, a point of contact where, and we have the manpower, an understanding can be achieved regarding their block sale requirement that only requires one meeting, right? And then an agreement that block finance will be transferred to them, if necessary in cash, and no questions will be asked about, there has to be a formal legal undertaking about this going forward in terms of this information for GST, etc. Whether even they'll trust the government on that, I don't know. So I think that's how you would protect small business to the maximum extent possible and understand, I'm going to tell you in a minute that resources are not a constraint, at least for now. But understand that a lot of them will fold up. And therefore, if you get a strike rate of even 70% in saving these businesses temporarily, what you're trying to do here is prevent erosion in national wealth, right? You don't want, so if you take the organized sector example, if Vistara can't earn the revenue to pay its employees and pay its working capital costs, and you can't, and you expect them then to sort of eat into their net worth to do so, then by September, Vistara, without subsidy from the rest of the Tata Group, will not be a going airline forever. So that the logic there is very clear with organized sector. You pay them, and then you have a contract with them where you say that you will treat your suppliers in the same way. Since I'm paying your wages and I'm paying your working capital costs from the public exchequer, you will continue to make payments to your suppliers on the basis of 2 years average, irrespective of whether they're supplying you or not. And you drill down that supply chain through a contract. This is where we need industry's help, right? That system can be put in place, I think, in a week. And that will ameliorate a lot of the economic cost of the organized sector dealing with the unorganized sector, and the unorganized sector dealing with the organized consumer. So I can have a social contract with my hairdresser, correct? But that's because I'm the organized consumer. That is not going to be true of the person who gets their hair cut under a tree.
Yeah.
Right? So
Yeah.
what I was saying in the beginning of this response was referring to that supply chain. The second supply chain can be done if there's political will. And again, I repeat, I do not think resources are constrained at this time.
Okay, let me get into that resources question, Dr. Roy. So, you repeated that resources are not constrained. Elaborate, please.
Number one, we know from research that there's $1 trillion, sorry, 1 trillion rupees, 1 trillion rupees, not dollars, 1 trillion rupees sitting in unspent balances across the governments of India. It's too long to go into in this interview. A lot of people know it, policy wonks know it. We don't talk about it because, what?
State and central.
Pardon? Both
State
governments
and
of India.
central
Governments of India, panchayats.
Oh.
But we have a full fix on these accounts. There's no problem. We know where the money is because we have something called PFMS. So our information systems, give us centralized overview over all these accounts. That's how I know there are unspent balances in the first place. So what typically has happened is that, I'm a sort of recipient of NREGA funds. I have not issued utilization certificates. I'm supposed to deposit the money back. I don't do it. There's no particular incentive for anybody up the chain at this time to force me to bring it back. So it sort of hangs out there. This has been happening for about 10, 15 years now. Hence, we have this float. It's a one-time float.
Okay.
So if you have a commitment to gouge it out and you take 6 months to gouge it out, it involves a massive effort on part of the finance bureaucracy. I don't know whether they're up to the hard work. I hope they are in a war. Then I'm only saying that because they haven't done it before. So I have to incentivize them and explain why it's important to do it now. Then I can immediately front load that money out into the system by raising WME. And I'm sure RBI will cooperate and vastly reduce the cost of using WME. Right? Yeah. Anyway, the cost of using WMA don't matter because if the RBI makes money on it, I can get it back as dividend and that sort of thing. That's a trivial problem. But I have the WMA instrument to immediately increase cash flows across the treasuries of all the places I've been saying. I would say in maximum 5 working days. Yeah. And if the banks cooperate, even less, because the banks have cash in and they can run down their cash reserves. They know that WMA is going to be used and it's going to come into the bank. Right?
Yeah.
So that's my first line of defense. That's my first line of defense. Okay. My second line of defense is to go out and borrow. And there's ample liquidity in the system, as you know, and there is ample money floating around. The only question is how to relate this to non-business as usual borrowing architecture. So you'll have to distinguish the borrowing product from the vanilla borrowing product that we normally use when we want to mobilize, finances for central and state governments, right? So one of the things that I learned from John Maynard Keynes was what you could use here is something called a console. What is a console? A console is a financial product where I borrow from you, let's say 100 rupees, and I commit to pay you a fixed interest in perpetuity. I do not have any commitment to pay back the principal. And what happens typically with consoles, and this is what England used in the Second World War, is that at the end of the emergency, the government says that I'm going to be paying back all consoles within a year. And all this is clearly explained to the people who buy. And the people who buy are not people who are buying to just make money. They're obviously buying to make money because that's why people need places to put their cash, but they understand that it's being put to a use that is of benefit to the community and society and the economy. So we'll have to think about. I mean, I'm at the government's disposal. There are many products like this we can implement very quickly. And my estimate is that there's enough liquidity for borrowing at a pinch for as much as 3% of GDP incremental to what we have now. So I've already given you $3 trillion plus 3% of GDP. That's a lot of money. And then you have two options. One, in the interim, while you're doing this, you look at retained earnings that have been sequestered and are not being productively used by places in the organized corporate sector, including the public sector, and are likely to be mobilized to deal with this crisis. That is, they're just going to sit there, and they're not going to be mobilized to pay to buy these consoles either. And you sequester them by sort of force giving them consoles and requiring them to give us the cash. The one thing, then there's one final instrument, but the one thing you do not do at any point in time in this circumstance is to issue foreign sovereign bonds. You do not do that because of the crisis, and you simply do not know how that will pan out. So unless we come up with a multilateral product, the IMF or somebody, it's a very bad idea to issue foreign sovereign bonds. We don't need the foreign exchange. A lot of the expenditure is going to be on convertibles. and the minor amounts that we have to import, we have plenty of reserves. All right? I've thought this through. The last is expansion in money supply to fund an incremental fiscal deficit over and above borrowing. So to conclude, what I'm saying is that I can find you 10% of GDP in 3 months. If you can assure me that you know how to spend the money and the money will be spent to achieve a concrete real economy purpose. Because if that does not happen, the consequences of the economy are very serious. We are administering very powerful antibiotic here in a wartime. That antibiotic must work. If it doesn't, the side effects can kill. And that is the major macro danger. Otherwise, there is a macroprudential path which we can follow, which should significantly expand public resources for this emergency.
Okay, 2 questions, Dr. Roy. So the extent of fiscal support that you think the economy will need is would be how much?
I don't know. That's the real economy question. My answer as a fiscal guy is as much as it takes. That's a real economy question. I'm not a communist. You have to tell me what you need to spend on. Do your costings and tell me this should have been done by now. I need to know how much, for example, and everything is non-parametric, so I have some sympathy. For example, you will have to spend on your medical personnel. And we're not doing that, it's obvious, it's shameful. What I mean is that if a doctor, by the reason of infection or some other disability, is out of action, then the cost of the economy is a multiple of what it would be in business as usual. Therefore, our doctors need to be mollycoddled. They need to be fed and watered. Their families need to be taken care of, just like soldiers in wartime. Yeah, they need to be transported to their place of work safely. They need to be kept secure and need to be brought back home. That is not happening. If you did that, you would probably have to raise your current expenditure on these doctors by 3 to 4 times of what you're spending on now. I don't know. You need to tell me how much that is. Once you tell me how much that is and how you're going to spend it and when you need the money and what you need to buy, then I can give you the money. That's my job. And somebody else has to help you buy the stuff you need. But you have to take that decision. And that decision has clearly not been taken. That our medical professional staff need to be protected and therefore we have to spend far more on them than we do at BAU. This is where the serious thinking needs to go. What I'm trying to communicate is that getting the money is not a problem. So we have to not think, it's like wartime. If you have to build a tank, you find the money for it later.
Yeah.
So I'm saying I'll find the money for you, but tell me what you want to build and when you need the money and where you need it, right? So that we should not ask that question, how much will it all cost? What it takes, we'll find the money. And if the measures have been outlined to you fiscally, and there are many more, that's 7-8% of GDP. That's a lot of money. And this is what many countries are doing. This is effectively what the UK has done. Okay? This is effectively what Japan has done.
Yeah. Understood. Doctor, I have one last question, and I can't come to you from Bombay and not ask you what the role of the central bank plus banking regulator should be in something like this. I think there have been 2 or 3 obvious things that at least a lot of people are asking for. One is easier sort of bad loan classification rules, restructuring rules. There is even a suggestion that the RBI should, in this stage, be willing to do direct monetization by buying government bonds in the primary markets if required. They are obviously also managing the external front by ensuring that dollar shortages don't come up. They're managing the local money markets with liquidity. So they're juggling a lot of balls, but a broader picture of what what monetary policy plus banking regulatory policies can do in this situation.
No, I think what the government has been doing so far is very good. The authorities, I mean, the Reserve Bank of India and the banking regulator. I don't quite see why the stock markets need to be kept open, but that's a different matter. I think the announcements by the finance minister yesterday regarding these procedural matters were very welcome. You've seen action on 579 of IBC, and that's very welcome. Several other measures have been taken. The monetization of is exactly what I was talking about. But you don't do it through a vanilla product. A central bank buying bonds directly is fine. I would like to do it through consoles, but that's a trivial matter. In the sense that, the principle I accept. And I do not think that there is any, essentially what you're trying to do there is increase M1, right? You get that, right?
Yeah.
How you do it is not an issue. You're basically going to increase M1. The dollar liquidity issue is a serious issue, but I need to know what the consequences are, because my primary purpose of using dollars or any foreign currency now is to make sure that we have money to fight the war. So companies will just have to tell me that if what it means to not have dollar liquidity. Does it mean that their costs of borrowing go up and things become more expensive, in which case we address that problem. So I need to be convinced that to address dollar liquidity, I need to address the supply of dollars versus encouraging a switch from dollars to rupees. Are you with me?
Yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah, so that's very important, and I think these conversations are not happening, sufficiently out of silo within the financial markets. They've got to understand that they're fighting this war together. So what I expect from them, I'm not in government, so what I expect from them doesn't matter. But what government ought to expect from them is you tell me what your core problem is. Don't tell me you want more dollars. The core problem is that you've been borrowing cheap, and now you're constrained, and therefore your costs are going to go up. It's going to affect your business. Then exit dollars, come in here and make your borrowing less expensive by subsidizing you, right? Yeah. Finally, for the central bank, I think is doing its job very well. The central bank has clearly signaled that it is going to be an accommodative central bank, and that's very welcome. Not having to deal with any of that, my independence and autonomy stuff that is important in business as usual, but not now. But I expect the Monetary Policy Committee to do its job rather differently now. We need to understand very clearly now in a calibrated way from the inflation data because we have to understand one thing, inflation now is going to be structural. Yeah. It's not going to be demand pull, cost push, the usual stuff that central banks look at. So that inflationary expectations chain will not work. So what the Monetary Policy Committee needs to focus on is not what is happening to inflation to do what to do with the repo rate, but what is happening to inflation in its structural composition. So I'd be expecting the Reserve Bank and the Monetary Policy Committee in their next meeting to roll up their sleeves and give us some picture of this, because that is important information in understanding how effectively our supply chains are working, and therefore the impact of that on real output, right? Here, inflation is going to be a signal of that, not a macroeconomic signal of too much money chasing too few goods, except trivially. Too much money is chasing too few goods in structural inflation because goods are not coming. So we need to know where they're not coming, how they're not coming, so that all India disaggregation that RBI has should be very much in play when the MPC comes out next time. That's my expectation from them. It's not their mandate, but I hope they step up to the plate. Finally, I think the RBI needs to ensure Finally, the RBI needs to ensure one thing. To the maximum extent possible, it must be the case throughout that R is as less than G as possible. And therefore, please take a realistic estimate of G going forward and keep R less than G. That's your macro guidance in a war-like economy to keep in terms of the R-G relationship, not in a business as usual relationship. It's upended. You start by saying my task is to keep R minus G, is max R minus G. So then you need an estimate of G and where it's going. We know it's going south, right? Yeah. So we need to know how much R needs to go south, and then we need to know whether there are any umbrella wedges near zero. But that's not a problem we're going to face yet. We have about 6 months to go. But we're not that close to zero. We shouldn't anticipate first world problems before we reach them.
Okay, and going in the direction that other central banks have done, which is sort of purchase assets beyond just government assets, if required, the central bank here should be willing to consider it as well. I think the first point is of concern in the corporate bond market. If in the judgment of the central bank that is required, they should give up on the conservatism that they've held on to so far.
If in the judgment of the central bank, yes, but in my judgment, that is not the time for that has not come.
Okay.
It is distracting for us because we need to understand that what we're trying to protect here are incomes and net worth, not financial asset worth, but incomes and net worth in the real economy. The focus should be there. If as a derivative consequence of doing so, one needs to end up buying financial assets, fine. But in my view, it is premature to worry about the denigration of net worth of financial assets. We need to protect net worth of physical assets. We need to protect the real economy as a priority. The financial sector will just have to wait initially. But that is a judgment that is the central bank has to take. But my own judgment, since I'm doing this interview, is that the time to think about that is not now, but a few months ahead.
All right. Doctor, I'm going to leave it there. I've taken more time than I had planned, but thank you so much. This has been very educative. Appreciate you taking the time to run us through what all we will need to tackle in the next few months, actually. Appreciate it. Thanks for watching Bloomberg.
Thank you. Thank you.
According to a recent report,